Good evening, everyone. My name is Christine Goodfellow. I'm the Academic Programme Manager here at Gresham College, and it's delightful to see so many of you in Barnardson Hall tonight, despite the absolutely foul weather outside. So thank you very much for braving the rain. And also welcome to everyone who is watching online tonight. We're very happy that you have taken the time to join our lecture. So a few housekeeping. As you probably know, if there's a fire alarm, please help us clear the hall as quickly as possible. There's 2 exits there, and there will be staff members helping you find the meeting point. After the lecture, there will be a Q&A. You can either join by scanning the QR code if you're in the hall, or raising your hand. Either way, we'll try to have a good mix between online and in-person questions. When you raise your hand, please wait till the microphone is coming to you, and then be brave, speak into the microphone. And then Robin will try to answer as many questions as possible afterwards. It's my great pleasure to welcome back our Gresham Professor of Physics, Professor Robin May. And this is why I'm taking my cheat sheet out, because the credentials are just too long. Robin is the Professor of Infectious Disease at the University of Birmingham and Interim Chief Scientist at the UK Health Security Agency. Between July 2020 and September 2025, he served as Chief Scientific Advisor at the Food Standards Agency, FSA. He's a Fellow of the Academy of Medical Sciences, a Wolfson Royal Society Research Merit Fellow. That's quite a mouthful.
They're a mouthful, I'm skipping.
A Fellow of the American Academy of Microbiology. And the series for this year that Robin May has designed is all about emotions. Why do we have emotions? Tonight is the 3rd one in this series about how do we grieve. And I'll just let you get on with it.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, and yes, thank you particularly for coming on a really depressing weather night to a really depressing topic. It's probably something that you all need treatment for, to be honest, just by being here. So those of you who might have been before to any of my lectures, you'll know that usually we try and make this quite a light-hearted event and have some jokes. I'm afraid this is the most depressing lecture that I've probably ever written in my life, and it's pretty miserable. So I'm apologising in advance for the fact that those of you in the hall are stuck for the next 50 minutes or so listening to a very miserable lecture. Those of you at home can just turn off now and go and watch something far more fun. But just slightly seriously for a second, I very much recognise this is a topic that is difficult for many people. If you're one of those people, particularly if you're listening online, we do have on our website, appearing in front of you, links to help and support. So please don't sit and struggle alone. There are lots of people out there who can help you if need be. So without further ado, what I want to talk about tonight is why we grieve. And for those who might have been to some of the earlier lectures in this series, we're thinking about the kind of biology and evolution and neuroscience and mechanism, I guess, behind many of our emotions. And grief, I think, is a particularly fascinating one. Because most of our other emotions we feel as being very personal. So what makes me laugh is not necessarily what makes you laugh, right? What makes me very angry, you might think is only marginally irritating. But what makes us grieve is pretty universal. And what's interesting, I think, about this is it's universal even if you haven't experienced it. So, for example, if you don't have children or you don't have a sibling, you nonetheless understand intuitively to some degree, what it would be like to lose those individuals. And so this is a kind of unifying emotion that we all know about from quite an early age. That's not to say it's universal felt by people, of course, clearly not. People respond very differently, and later in the lecture we'll talk a little bit about why that might be. But it's kind of core to our being. And it has stirred, if you like, some of the most dramatic moments in human history, and particularly in creativity. And so in front of you, you have this remarkable memorial to the dead by Bartholomé in France that was largely inspired by the very premature death of his wife, and this fantastic piece of sculpture, which I think really kind of epitomizes the kind of feelings of grief that people have. You can see the people outside wailing and the 2 people symbolically entering the afterlife in the middle. And so grief has driven a lot of kind of human creativity. And it's something that, as I said, we kind of intuitively think about, we know about. But actually, it's quite difficult to put your finger on what grief is. And if you think about the definition of grief, so largely, if you look it up in the dictionary, grief is defined as the feeling of extreme sorrow or deep sorrow in response to an irretrievable loss, usually of someone, okay, but not necessarily, and we'll talk about that a bit later. And so it's about that loss of something that you can't get back and was valuable to you, important to you. And particularly, obviously, we think about this in the context of people dying. And some aspects of grief, I think, are so universal that every culture, every person understands them. And so for example, this is the slightly grueling painting by Rubens, which you might know, The Massacre of the Innocents, this Bible story about Herod, in a vain attempt to try and eliminate the next coming, sends out his soldiers to kill all the baby boys in a vain attempt to track down the baby Jesus. And these kind of paintings, of which there are many, really kind of encapsulate this idea of grief. Right? And I think all of us can understand that idea that the loss of an infant, particularly a violent loss of an infant, would be overwhelmingly awful and trigger this grief feeling. So on one level, the symptoms of grief, if you like, are completely obvious, right? We all think of ourselves, if you were in this picture, if you were one of those parents, you too would be crying and wailing and distraught, and your life would never be the same again. So on one level, it's immediately obvious. On another level, it's completely counterintuitive, because if you think back evolutionarily in terms of time, this is probably the most ill-advised evolutionary reaction you could possibly have, right? If you're a parent in the middle of the Serengeti in Africa, thousands of years ago, and your baby is eaten by a lion, the worst thing you can possibly do is lie down on the ground and cry, because the lion will just come back for a bigger meal afterwards. Okay? It would be evolutionarily much better to run away and not worry about it so much. And actually, we know that grief can be incredibly debilitating. So not just acutely, clearly, people cry, they wail, often curl up very physically, do lots of things that would actually make you vulnerable to predation back through evolutionary time. But also, it's a very long-lasting emotion. And for many people, it has consequences like a loss of appetite, inability to work, inability to go out and do things, that presumably, over evolutionary time, would have been very disadvantageous. So that sort of raises the question in our minds about why has this emotion not been eliminated by evolution? Why have we retained it? And there's no clear answer to that. But there are some interesting hypotheses. And perhaps the most compelling hypothesis is that grief, particularly grief in adults, is actually an unavoidable consequence of emotions that we have as children to loss. And we all know this intuitively. You might be able to remember yourselves back to being so little and feeling this overwhelming sense of sadness at the temporary, although you don't know it's temporary, loss of something, particularly a parent, right? So I have a very visual memory, for example, of being a bit older than this, old enough certainly that I could kind of walk around places, but being in a department store and my mum getting on the escalator and going up, and I was too scared to get on the escalator and stayed at the bottom. And I have this, I can close my eyes now and I can picture my mum sort of walking off at the top, oblivious to the fact that I was at the bottom. And really bursting into tears, thinking, that's it, I've been abandoned forever in Debenhams, I'm never going to make it out. So that sense of loss that we have as children triggers a very potent response, right? Like this, you cry, you wail, you give all the symptoms of grief that we see in adults also. But of course, in infants, this is evolutionarily very, very sensible indeed. Because if you're out on the Serengeti and your mum has just dropped you by accident and forgotten about you as a baby, you need to get your mum back pretty pronto, otherwise you really will be lion fodder. And the easiest way to do that is to scream and cry and look very distressed, because hopefully your parent will come back, or if your parent doesn't, maybe some related human from your tribe will come back and protect you against the threats that are out there. So grief in children is probably a strong advantage, and so consequently it may be that grief in adults is just sort of unavoidably hangover, if you like, from those grieving periods in children. There are other reasons, and we'll turn to those in a bit later, where it may be compounded in adults in a more interesting way. But certainly it's something that we experience from a very early age, and most of us continue to experience through our entire lives. As you might imagine, like most emotions, people have done quite a lot of work to try and understand how the brain controls this emotion of grief. Clearly, this is quite a challenging area. It's very difficult. People who are grieving quite rightly, are not particularly interested in participating in clinical trials. But there has been some interesting work done. And as you might expect from a relatively complicated emotion, it shows a relatively complicated pattern in the brain. So here, in an fMRI, so this is a functional imaging technique shown looking at active areas of the brain, comparing people who are grieving with people who are matched in all other ways but are not grieving at the time. And what you see in red are multiple areas of the brain that are lighting up. And so this is not, as we might intuitively expect, this is not a single part of your brain that controls grief, but a complex set of emotions. What's particularly interesting here, I think, is that these emotions that are coming from the brain are coming from a variety of different areas. So some of the areas that light up are areas that we know are driven by very strong emotions, are active during very strong emotions. They are triggered by things like anxiety and generalized upset, and so that kind of is logical, right? You're very upset, those areas are active. What's interesting to me is there are also other areas that are perhaps less intuitive. So one of the areas that lights up in the brain is the part of the brain that is known to be very associated with pain perception, not just emotional pain, but also physical pain. And so actually when people describe this, and people who've been through extreme grief often describe it as being very physical, very visceral. They talk about being punched in the stomach or aching all over. And actually, this is probably real. So this is because the same area of the brain that perceives those signals of being punched in the stomach or having terrible muscle ache are being activated by the grief you experience. And so that idea of kind of heartbreak, if you like, is actually true in the sense that you are physically feeling this pain in that part of the brain. Less obvious, but quite interesting, I think, is the other part of the brain that activates here is an area called the cingulate cortex. And that has been associated with positive reward. In other words, it's part of the brain that controls telling you to do something again because it's good for you. So for example, when you eat, when you're hungry, it's the part of the brain that says that was a good thing to do, keep eating. And so it's part of the brain that controls survival responses, positive rewards for survival responses. And this feels very odd, right? Why would your brain be telling you this is a good thing to do when you're clearly incredibly miserable? And I think this gets back to that point we were just talking about previously, that's because in some circumstances, it's not a bad thing to do, it's a good thing to do, particularly in infancy. So it feels awful, but as a survival response, it's sensible, and therefore your brain is rewarding you for that, and we'll touch on that a bit later. And actually, in some ways, what's quite interesting to me is that this scientific, revelation, if you like, that there's a kind of reward pathway associated with grief, kind of links intuitively to what more creative people have known for hundreds of years, which is these two emotions are intertwined. And so this is Tennyson, the poet, in his famous poem In Memoriam, written in memoriam of his friend, his teenage friend, an early adulthood friend who died very prematurely, in which he talks about this idea that there is a sweetness to be drunk with loss. So there is a positive side, a very miserable, but nonetheless kind of rewarding part of emotions. And many, many poets and indeed artists and others have kind of symbolized this sort of sweetness of loss, which we'll come back to at the end. So one of the ideas then is that we have these emotions that are rewarding in early infancy and they stay with us in adulthood. That's probably not the only reason. There has been quite a lot of speculation that in adulthood, there may still be some benefits, at least historically, perhaps not so much now, to this grieving process. And one of the ideas here is that actually grief is a really painful but important way of reinforcing the memory of something that has happened. And so particularly if you think back to early kind of modern humans, when we lived in very small family groups, and particularly when nomadic, it's incredibly important in circumstances to know who your family group is and to remember if somebody's not there anymore. And so, I mean, this sounds kind of really trite, but if someone has died, it's quite important that you remember they have died because it will motivate you differently in terms of how much food you might have to gather, how many mouths you have to feed. You need to remember if you had 9 children, whether you've still got 9 children or whether actually now you've only got 8 children. And so one of the ideas is that this grief in adulthood has been retained also because historically, evolutionarily, it was a way of very, very strongly reinforcing to people exactly what their circumstances, what their social circumstances were, which itself was a survival trait. Difficult to test that, but I think an interesting idea. That idea that it is a potent emotion and a beneficial, in some ways, emotion in adulthood also helps explain some of the really otherwise enigmatic things that we as humans do around grief. And in particular, the most obvious, of course, is this idea of rights associated with loved ones who have died. Okay? And this is a hugely controversial area, this idea about when did we as a species evolve this idea of burial, for example, or other kind of associations with family members or relatives or even just friends who have died. And again, this is quite a counterintuitive idea, right? So scientifically, regardless of what your religious belief is, scientifically, we know that someone who is dead is not going to help anymore with family care or all these kind of things in our evolutionary history. So they're not beneficial. And yet, we know, going back a very long time, that people invested a lot of time and effort in individuals who were dead. And so this, for example, is one of the earliest examples we have of a burial. This is, we know, a human 3-year-old who was clearly buried in what is now Kenya 78,000 years ago. And you can see this is a mixture of reconstruction and imaging, but they've been put into this fetal position and they have been deliberately buried, as far as we can tell, about 78,000 years ago. So at a very early point in modern human history, people were investing effort to do something with dead family members after they died, okay, like burying them, suggesting, even at this early point in kind of human evolution, people had some kind of concept of remembering people who've died, and possibly even a concept of the afterlife. Well, that's hugely controversial. It does raise all sorts of interesting questions about whether many of the habits we have associated with grief and grieving and dying are themselves ways of kind of reinforcing this memory, if you like, of the loved one who's gone, and kind of reinforcing your new social structure that has been imposed by that loss. To me, one of the most interesting things about this is it also starts to broach into areas where grief is even less logical, if you like, than we might otherwise have thought. And so this is perhaps one of the most interesting examples. So this is a very old photo from the early 1900s of an excavation in a quarry in Germany, in Oberkassel. And during this quarrying process, they came across human remains and other remains. And in fact, where that, you can just about see where this little cross is down the bottom here, is a site of what clearly was a burial from now dated to about 14,000 years ago. So more recent than the previous one I showed, but still a very long time ago. And what's really interesting about this burial, 14,000 years ago, is it includes 2 humans and a dog. And particularly interesting is that the dog, the skeletal remains of the dog, has clear evidence of having had distemper, which is a disease of dogs, and then survived for some period of time afterwards. And that's pretty remarkable, because distemper is essentially a lethal disease of dogs. Dogs out in the wild who get distemper don't recover. The only way they recover is if they're intensively nursed by humans. And so that rather suggests that in this 14,000-year-old burial, what you have is, in some ways, a beloved family pet. We have clearly no idea what a family pet dog looked like 14,000 years ago, or what people did with it, but the fact that something that is not human has been buried suggests some emotional attachment and perhaps some kind of grieving process associated with that. And we'll touch on that towards the end of the lecture, this idea that grief is not restricted just to human-human interactions, but also to interactions that we make with other species. So I said at the beginning that all humans grieve, pretty much. There are very rare exceptions. There are some neurological conditions in which people seem not particularly to grieve, or even that's a bit kind of controversial. The most obvious is people who have diagnosed psychopathy and very low emotional understanding of other people often show lower levels of grief, but even people with quite severe psychopathy will show symptoms of grief for particular people who are close to them. And so I think generally it's a pretty ubiquitous human emotion. So if grief is a ubiquitous human emotion, is it only a human emotion, or does it extend to other animals? And I think historically we have thought this is a very human emotion, but increasingly we're aware of the fact that it actually extends certainly to many of our nearest relatives. So these, for example, chimps, which as you all know are the nearest species to humans, pretty definitively show signs of grief. So particularly chimp mothers whose infants die will very often carry around the dead body for quite a long period of time. Sometimes they will stop eating for several days, they will withdraw from the group, and they will show symptoms of what in humans we would call depression. And there are some well-documented cases, actually, of chimp adults essentially giving up eating and starving themselves to death after the loss of family members. And we clearly can't be sure that this is a grief process, but it looks and feels very much like human grief. I guess to me, as a kind of biologist, it's not particularly surprising that a species with which we share 98.5% of our DNA has very similar emotions to us. Chimps, if anyone's been to see chimps, particularly in the wild, you certainly my experience is you can look a chimp in the eye and kind of feel a lot of kinship there. So it's maybe not that surprising that they undergo grief processes. Maybe more surprising, though, is that we start to see evidence of this in animals that we think of as being very, very different to ourselves. And you might have heard this story, but particularly recently there's been a lot of really interesting evidence around orca killer whales. And so a couple of years ago, there was quite extensive footage of this actually in the news. The large adult killer whale that you can just see breaching the surface here is Teleque just off the coast of North America. Gave birth to a stillborn calf, which you can see up here on the top, and then proceeded to carry that stillborn calf for 17 days. And you can imagine carrying a stillborn orca calf in the water is really quite a big challenge. There is no reason one can think of to do this biologically other than the idea that this mother was grieving for her stillborn infant. And actually that behaviour has been reported repeatedly in orca. And I think that is kind of symbolic of the fact that we now know that killer whales have really quite a complicated social structure. They have a very high level of intelligence, as we know from historical kind of use in theme parks, happily something that's been discontinued. But this idea that these are cognitively very developed animals, they understand social structures, they understand perhaps even the idea of loss, and so consequently maybe it's not that surprising they also have this sensation of grief, particularly for something as traumatic as losing an infant. So chimpanzees, orca, and the other big example that people have worked on quite extensively of non-human grief is in elephants. Elephants, again, an animal with a complicated social structure, we know that have very, very long-lasting relationships. And indeed, many of you might be familiar with these stories of elephants that have been separated for many years and apparently when reunited recognize each other and go through a period of intense greeting. And so they have quite an elaborate social structure like humans. And they also seem to grieve. Lots and lots of evidence of elephants grieving over their own dead offspring, but also other members of their herd who have died, including elderly members of their herd. So potentially elephants are also, like us, have this concept of grieving even for individuals who they, I guess, could have expected to die because of old age. And one of the most interesting things about elephants is that they are also one of the few, probably perhaps the only non-human animal that seems to have some concept of after-death care. So there are quite well-documented cases of elephants revisiting sites at which herd members have died and spending quite extensive periods of time doing this, kind of fondling the bones of dead relatives, standing around. We have clearly no idea what they're thinking about, what they're doing, but it is definitely true that they are going out of their way, apparently, to visit these sites. They're not feeding whilst they're there, they're not doing anything obviously advantageous. And so the suggestion is that this is a process of mourning or remembering or recognizing the dead of their herd. And one of the reasons I think that this sort of makes biologically logical sense is going back to that point that I made earlier about early humans, that actually reinforcing, however painful, the idea of loss from a family group is quite important for maintaining social structure. And so just as early humans needed to remember how many children there were or how many relatives in their particular group, elephants also need to remember that particular individuals have gone. We know there's a lot of learning that's passed on between elephants and a herd, and so the idea that they might be recognizing the loss of, for example, an older elephant who had a lot of learning to pass on makes kind of logical sense, even though for us it's slightly challenging, this idea of an animal that's so different from ourselves undergoing a process that maybe isn't as different as we think it might be. So grief, definitely universal to humans and perhaps to many animals, particularly animals with higher social structures. If we turn our attention back to humans, though, then we have to think about the idea of grief in humans, and particularly the question that is sometimes asked, which is, how much grief is the right amount of grief? I think this is an incredibly fraught question. No one, at least or me, would deem to tell anybody else how much they should be upset about the loss of even a grandparent or somebody who you might have expected to die, and even less somebody who has been taken away too early. But if you're thinking about psychological interventions, clearly we do know that for some people, grief can become overwhelming and can massively impact on the rest of their lives. And so I think there is also an imperative to think about how we can help people who may be stuck in a level of grief which is limiting their future potential, if you like. So this book, the DSM, which is the kind of Bible, if you like, of psychologists on neurological or psychological challenges, recognises two sorts of grief-associated disorders. And I use the word disorder very, very cautiously here, because again, I think it's very difficult for any one person to tell somebody else that they're grieving too much or indeed too little. But nonetheless, the DSM recognises two sorts of grief disorder. So prolonged grief disorder, which it defines as extensive grief going on beyond 6 to 12 months. And again, I think to me, this is a very, very fraught area because, grief is not the same depending on the loss, right? So there are some circumstances where someone might have died, and if you're still massively upset every day, 12 months later, many of us might say, wow, that's kind of not great. There are other circumstances where I think that's a completely normal reaction, depending on the loss that's seen. So it's a fraught area. But nonetheless, prolonged grief disorder is defined as people who are stuck in a process of grief beyond that many other people would experience. And then there's a second one, which is kind of interesting, which is this idea of ambiguous loss. And this is the idea of people grieving for something that actually hasn't been lost. And so one of the examples of this is, for example, people who undergo a grieving process when they discover they're infertile. Nothing's been lost, right? No baby has died, but they have lost the ability to reproduce, and many people experience a kind of grief symptom there. And there is a real question there about to what extent that is a natural process of coming to terms with something versus something that is kind of pathological if it goes on for a long period of time. We know very little about these grief disorders, partly because it's extremely difficult to say, here are a group of people who clearly have a grief disorder, and here are a group of people who are grieving perfectly normally. And so there's been very little work in this area, although one of the interesting things that has been done is comparing people who are in this process of prolonged grief, so beyond that others have, with a group of people who've experienced the same loss, but are no longer in that period of grief. So in other words, what is it that's different about prolonged grief versus, for want of a better word, normal grief? And actually, one of the interesting things is that the area of the brain that is particularly seems to be associated with prolonged grief is this area here, the nucleus accumbens. And that area is associated, again, with reward. And so one of the ideas is that people who are in prolonged grief may have kind of overactive reward pathway, if you like. The brain is telling them, this is a good thing, keep going, keep going, keep going, beyond that point at which it's useful. And so that potentially opens a door to some ideas around kind of treatment in due course. But again, an area that's really quite challenging to think about tackling. So we all grieve. The question is, can there be, and we talked a little bit about the advantages in early infancy, but are there also disadvantages? And unfortunately, the answer to this is overwhelmingly yes. There are quite a lot of disadvantages to grief. Not least, it's really quite bad for your health. So when you experience a loss, one of the first things that happens is you have, understandably, an elevation in stress hormones, particularly this guy. This is cortisol, okay? Stress hormone that's triggered by lots of stressful things, doesn't have to be grief-associated, but goes up. Cortisol is it's a good thing. It's useful to have cortisol. It triggers a stress reaction. So, for example, if someone suddenly jumps out to try and mug you, cortisol will help you run away and do all the things you need to do. But in this context, it's quite damaging. So cortisol levels rise shortly after the loss that triggers the grief. And if you're in grief, unfortunately, they stay high for a long time, and that is not good. So this is a study done in people who've been bereaved versus age-matched controls. And what you see in the graph on the left-hand side is that, understandably, their cortisol is up early on, shortly after they've been bereaved, but it stays up 6 months later. So this extended period of stress is one of the reasons that grief causes physiological impacts that are not good for you. And the physiological impacts it causes are very wide and very far-ranging, and many of them go on to ultimately have quite significant health impacts. So one of the things that happens immediately after a bereavement and grief, of course, is a big change in people's behaviours. Obviously, lots of people become very traumatized. They don't eat, they don't look after themselves very well. And one of the big things that typically happens is a very disturbed sleep pattern. Interesting, the sleep pattern is disturbed very early on, but does recover, unlike cortisol. So you can see in a similar set of studies here that shortly after bereavement here, people's average sleep drops by quite a lot, actually, a couple of hours a night. And that, I guess, intuitively is not that surprising. I think most of us could imagine if you've been bereaved, you probably don't sleep very well for a while. But you recover that generally by 6 months. Not quite back to normal, but within 6 months, your sleep has got much better for most people. So it's not cortisol that's driving the sleep pattern, but it is associated with it. However, there are things that you can't see quite as obviously asleep, which are quite damaging during bereavement and grief. And so one of the big impacts in particular is on your immune system. And one of the most well-documented is on these little cells you can see here. These are not human ones, these are actually ones in a zebrafish, but we have the same thing. So you can see these little cells zipping in and out. So what you have here in this movie is a blood vessel going down one side of the screen. And if you look carefully, you can see little cells that are jumping out of the blood vessel and wriggling their way across to the left-hand side of the screen where there is an infection. These white blood cells are called neutrophils. We all have them. There are zillions of them skipping around your body at the moment. And it is those cells that respond as kind of first response soldiers, if you like, to an infection. So, for example, if you cut your finger, these will race in to clear up all the bacteria you've got in your finger. If you inhale something bad and you have a kind of chest infection, they will move into the lung, try and clear them. They are the frontline kind of clearance troops of the immune system. And they respond quite rapidly to hormonal or to kind of neurological changes in our bodies, including grief and bereavement. And so what we know actually is that relatively swiftly after a bereavement, during the grieving process, people's neutrophil number goes up. And that's kind of superficially sounds quite good. You might want additional neutrophils to help you fight off an infection. Unfortunately, their function, their ability to kill bacteria and other pathogens drops off quite significantly, and it stays low for quite a long period of time. And so there's been some very extensive work done by one of my colleagues in Birmingham, Janet Lord and colleagues, looking at bereavement in older individuals. And what you see is a long-term suppression for several months of neutrophil function. And that is probably one of the reasons why, as we all know anecdotally, people often get ill on the back of a bereavement. And indeed, in older people, quite often, that can be quite serious and indeed life-threatening in the surviving partner, for example. And so this dampening of the immune system is quite a challenge. On the plus side, because we now know that, and it's a relatively selective thing, there might be ways in which we can help stimulate the immune system in advance. So one very trivial thing that one might think about is, for people whose partners are terminally ill, we might want to think about enhanced vaccination so that they are protected, ready for the fact they will be immune compromised after that person dies. So there's an impact on the immune system. There are actually wide-ranging impacts on immunity beyond just these cells. There are conflicting data on things like T cells, which are the things that respond to viruses. A bit unclear about whether T cells do better or worse after bereavement, but certainly your immune system is radically altered by grief. And then last but definitely not least, the thing that is really profoundly impacted is your cardiovascular system. So we know that during grieving process, people's pulse rate, their heart rate goes up. They have elevated blood pressure, perhaps not that surprising. You're very stressed out, your blood pressure goes up. And as a result, they have more significant cardiovascular impacts. And in fact, in studies of parents who have been bereaved by the loss of a child, you see an increase in mortality in those parents. And actually, the single biggest contributor is cardiovascular disease afterwards. So all of these slightly miserable consequences of undergoing grief lead, unfortunately, to higher mortality. And there's quite a lot of data suggesting that people who are bereaved die at a higher rate than people who are not. And you can see on this survival graph in the top left here, in red, are people who are bereaved versus the people who are age-matched and not bereaved in blue. And the difference in those lines doesn't look that great, actually. It's not that significant. But it's about 12%. And I think for most of us, if I told you you've got a 12% higher chance of dying this evening than you did yesterday evening, I think you'd be quite worried by that. And so that 12%, although it's only 12%, incrementally adds quite a lot. That process is particularly acute understandably, in the first few weeks after. So what we see here, if you look at relative rate of death in the surviving partner of someone who has died, it goes up very dramatically in the first few months, but then slowly comes back down almost to normal by about a couple of years in. And so for a period of time, although we don't actually have the immune studies and the cardiovascular studies out this far, what it looks like is that that first few months are particularly damaging in terms of health and particularly, therefore, a risk factor for death. And again, a miserable story, but perhaps something we can kind of think about medically. You know, if we think about prioritizing support, it's those early months, the first 6 to 9 months, that are really, really important for supporting bereaved individuals. There is a little tiny chink of good news in these population studies of bereavement, which is that for certain cases, we don't see this. In fact, we sometimes see the opposite. And so this is the same study as the top one, but now done in people whose partners died of cancer, relatively expectedly, if you like. So these are long diagnosed cancers. And what you see is that the bereaved partner, which is in red here, actually do better than people who haven't had this experience of the same age. And that is probably about, this is kind of evidence of how intervention can be useful, that is probably about medical support. If you're the partner of someone with a terminal cancer, you're getting a lot of support, hopefully, from healthcare colleagues, friends, family, etc. You're also much more acutely aware of things, right? If your partner has breast cancer, for example, you are much more aware of the importance of looking for lumps or unexpected bleeds if it's bowel cancer or all these other things. And so there's an element of awareness of risk, if you like, that comes with that. And so there are cases where this is not true, but generally speaking, being bereaved is not great. So it's a miserable experience, and it's really not good for us. And so the question is, can we control grief? And I don't mean just with a bit of self-control, but are there things we can do to help people who are grieving? And there's a sort of mixed message here. So people's first response is, wouldn't it be great if we could sort of take some kind of pill to solve this problem? Actually, I think that's not entirely clear, because if we said, we could give you a pill to immediately remove all your symptoms of grief, that might be intuitively quite attractive. You don't feel miserable anymore, but we don't really know what the long-term consequences of not grieving for someone might be. So I think I would say that would need to be approached with quite a lot of caution. But we're nowhere near that. In fact, we have no medication really that's particularly good. The only real trial for this has looked at SSRI, so a serotonin selective uptake inhibitor, related to antidepressants, if you like. And that showed no significant effect of medication versus non-medication in dealing with the symptoms of grief. What is much more promising is, particularly for people with prolonged grief, so where it's going on for a long period of time, is particularly this, cognitive behavioural therapy. So psychotherapies rather than drug treatment. CBT has shown very extensive benefit for people with prolonged grief and helping to come to terms with it. And so if you're listening to this and thinking you need some support, I would strongly encourage you looking at that. And the other thing I think we can do probably more of is addressing these kind of consequences of grief. We might not be able to tackle grief itself, but absolutely we should be worrying about supporting people's health and well-being afterwards. And ironically, many of the things we can do there are things that we should just be doing anyway, like good diet and healthy exercise. There's quite a weight of evidence showing that healthy diet, lots of vegetables, is quite a good way of tackling depression and anxiety in people with relatively mild symptoms, and therefore is probably also beneficial in grief. And similarly, exercise, etc., social interactions, all the things that sort of make sense normally are things we should probably be doubling down on for people who need support during the grieving process. So there are some things to do. There's a lot more research I think we need to do here to understand this better and to help people who are in a long-term grieving process. But perhaps a kind of bit of a positive story. So finally, I want to think a little bit about grief and how it's changing as human society changes. And if you think back over essentially all of human history, grief has really been driven by the loss of close relatives, pretty much. So we think that throughout most of human history, humans were in relatively small, first hunter-gatherer, then farming community groups of pretty much closely related individuals. We have archaeological evidence of some distant strangers in groups, but generally speaking, people lived in related family groups. And so grief has, for most of human time, been about people who you were related to dying. However, we are now in a much more complicated society where that starts to get slightly muddled. And clearly the most obvious way is that we now have very, very close relationships with people who we're not related to at all, and clearly, understandably, can be very impacted by the loss of those individuals. But we're also making interactions with things that are not human, and grief for those too. So the most obvious example, perhaps, are things like this. So this is one of our two dogs, happily still alive. If the other dog is listening, I'm sorry I haven't got a photo of you, other dog. But this dog is here, not happily not to epitomise grieving, but to point out the fact that we have very strong relationships with our pets. And I will be the first to admit that when Molly, eventually shuffles off to dog heaven, I will be distraught. She's not human, and I know, she is 14, at some point she is definitely not gonna be here anymore. I know all of that, but I will still be really upset. I will still grieve, okay? And I suspect I'm not alone in that in the room. Many of us will have grieved over family pets. Even pets that we probably didn't have that much of a relationship with. I remember the death of my first goldfish, and it was pretty traumatic, I can't say it would have been reciprocal the other way around, but nonetheless, we have a strong emotional attachment to domestic pets, which triggers grief that is not perhaps exactly the same as grief for the loss of another human, but it's not a long way away. Particularly when we're children, but sometimes as adults, we can also grieve for things that were never alive in the first place. So most of us remember, these are now, my kids are now teenagers, but this is my kids as well. They had very strong attachments to things like teddy bears or particular toys, little cloths that you took to bed, and I did too. I'm sure many of you here will have had a favourite teddy bear, and some of you may have even been unlucky enough to have lost that teddy bear and had that feeling of great upset. I'm sure many of us in the room and listening online have had that experience when you're leaving, a friend's house or family's house, and Teddy has been left behind, and you're an hour into your journey and have to turn around and go back because the level of grief is unable to be dealt with. So we make lasting relationships. Mostly we grow out of those when we are getting older, but not always. And many of us, even as adults, can really grieve over, it might be a teddy bear, it might be something that has emotional attachment, right? The jewelry that you inherited from somebody, or a family book or an heirloom or something that is lost causes grief. And we see that particularly, for things like house fires. Often you see people, grieving hugely, understandably, for the loss of things that were never alive. And so grief can be extended to stuff that is not even an animal. But what is most interesting to me is that we're entering an era where it may start to extend to all sorts of interesting, challenging areas. And the most obvious, perhaps, is in things like this. So we are starting to make relationships with things that we've created ourselves, like robots. Most of us don't have one of these. This is a NASA robot. But we are starting to interact with robots. And we know, overwhelmingly, that humans make very personal relationships with robots. A lot of the work around robot trials has shown this association that we have with robots. And in particular, there's this idea that many of you have heard of about this uncanny valley, where if a robot is quite like a human, but just not quite there, it kind of really creeps us out. And so actually, ironically, we make strong attachments either with robots that look incredibly like humans, or with robots that don't look like humans, they look like robots, but we nonetheless feel a strong association with them. And so we're starting to move into an era where robots are becoming an integrated part of our life, and we're starting to make associations with them. And so I think it's reasonable to assume that when those robots are no longer with us, we might start to grieve for robots. We may also, in fact not may, we do also start to experience those experiences for things that don't actually exist. And the most poignant example, I guess, is chatbots. So this is, I didn't know this until I put this actually. This is the first chatbot created, 1966. That's quite impressive, isn't it? It's a long time ago. I'm not sure it was particularly slick, but nonetheless, Eliza was the first chatbot. Nowadays, I suspect that, well, we can do a quick straw poll. Who in this room has interacted with a chatbot in the last month? I bought my insurance. Yeah, exactly. So many of us are interacting with chatbot. But I bet I'm not alone in having human emotions. When you're trying to book your car insurance with a chatbot and it does something stupid, I bet some of you have also typed, oh, for goodness sakes, wake up, chatbot. It's not alive, but we do that, right? We have this human interaction with them. And if your chatbot is a regular interaction and doing stuff well, you feel sad when it's not available anymore. And we know that. We know from trials with AI chatbots, for example, that people who've been involved in the trial for a period of time will often ask to say goodbye before the trial finishes. The chatbot's not alive, it doesn't know that, but the human wants to complete the process and say, I'm so sorry, it's been nice interacting with you. And this process of emotional attachment to something that's not alive has been dubbed the Tamagotchi effect. And this is an age distribution curve in the hall. Some of us will go, oh yeah, and some younger people in the hall will go like, what is he talking about? So for those of you who are not of a certain age, this was like state-of-the-art technology back in 1996. The Tamagotchi was a little thing that you could buy with this very advanced computer screen you can see there. And it would hatch. It was an egg, and it would hatch, and you had to look after it. You had to feed it and this stuff, and grow the Tamagotchi in your pocket, and look after it like a pet. And what people very rapidly noticed, this was a huge craze, lots and lots of people bought these, and what people rapidly noticed was that people formed strong emotional attachments, and then the battery would run out, and they'd be really upset, okay? They would be grieving for the loss of a small pink LCD screen that was kind of hanging around in their pocket for several weeks, because they'd formed an emotional attachment and were now transferring onto this inanimate object the feelings we have ultimately for other humans, and grieving about them. And I think that raises some really interesting questions for modern society, because we are starting to interact with robots, Tamagotchi, chatbots, all these inanimate things in really personal ways. And I bet I'm not alone in this audience in having at least one of these in my home. So robot lawnmowers, robot vacuums, robot floor mops, all these kind of things. Many of us have. Most of us, and I would say I'm in that camp, buy this because I don't like cutting the lawn, and I really like my robot cutting the lawn. But let's do a quick straw poll. Who's got a robot vacuum or a robot lawnmower anywhere? There's not very many in the hall. Those of you listening online will go, I'm turning mine on right now. And I bet, who's given it a name? Yes, see, look at that. That's what we do, right? You buy this thing that's inanimate, you give it a name. And in fact, many of us you can buy googly eyes for it, or little hats, or I even saw recently you can buy different outfits to put on here. So we are personalizing these robots. Now, I have to say, when my robot lawnmower dies, I will be sad, but only because I'll have to cut the lawn again. I probably won't grieve for it. But that relationship becomes quite different if the robot is really, really interacting closely. So, for example, in healthcare settings where we're increasingly developing really quite advanced robots, people are deliberately, if you like, encouraged to make associations. And so there's been quite a lot of work using robot cuddly toys with patients with dementia, for example, for companionship. And you might have seen this in Japan. There's a little cuddly seal that moves and talks and does all sorts of things. And it's shown very significant advantages in terms of delaying cognitive decline in patients with Alzheimer's. So that's a really useful robot. But then if the robot seal's battery runs out and it dies, in inverted commas, you're triggering grief in a vulnerable patient. I mean, that's quite a challenging concept, I think. And so I think we have to think very carefully as we start to do this, how are we going to handle these human-robot interactions and the consequences of them not continuing forever? And that has been particularly acutely evidenced in recent years, actually, with the rise of a quite interactive chatbots, and in particular, these ideas of kind of friend bots. So people creating online entities only really to socialize with, not to do something, not to buy your car insurance or to clean your home or something, but just to be your friend, to be your digital friend. And there's been quite an interesting study in the US with a company that developed these friend chatbots. Many people created a chatbot, and then it discontinued them, and it just cut the server down. And it told users it was going to do it. So it said, I can't remember, it was a month or something. In a month's time, I'm going to turn off the system, and Florence, your chatbot friend, is going to die. And during that period, many users went through a process that was really quite similar to the process that people go through with terminally ill relatives. This idea of departure, trying to get closure, and afterwards, grief process. And in fact, some people sought help, so counselling, to recover from the loss of their chatbot. And I think this is a really, really challenging area. There is some evidence that these can be very useful in helping things like loneliness and social isolation and people who struggle with human relationships. But there is a consequence, and the consequence is it comes with the social baggage, the emotional baggage that real relationships have too. And we need to think now, I think, about how we're going to help people with the idea of grieving because their chatbot no longer exists. Lots of interesting challenges for the future. A slightly depressing topic for the evening, but I'm hoping we can end with a final positive note from tennis again, which is maybe, although it's incredibly miserable, it is still better to have had all the positives that trigger grief than to not have it at all. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much for this fascinating lecture. I don't know whether I remember this correctly, but I seem to remember when Prince Philip died, one of the things that the Queen said was, grief is the price we pay for love. So that's kind of linking in to that. We've got some time for questions, so either by raising your hands, and then my lovely colleague Angela will bring you the microphone. If you would rather scan the QR code, please do so. I'm going to check the screen here. If you're online, you should also have a QR code on your screen, and we're going to try to be fair. Maybe we can bring up the house lights a little bit.
Because we can't see you.
Fantastic, thank you so much. Can we maybe start on this side, Angela? We've got two questions here. Thank you.
Firstly, thank you so much for this lecture. It was really interesting, albeit a bit depressing, but one to remember
Very
for
depressing.
sure. My question was more so related to religion and afterlife. You know, when you were presenting results of the studies showing the symptoms of grief, like reduced immunity, reduced sleep, did they also control for religion? So, for example, whether the participant's religion believes in an afterlife or not?
Yeah, so not in that study. There has been quite a lot of work on this, generally, there are a lot of caveats here, but there is some evidence that belief in an afterlife is helpful in people dealing with grief and reducing grief. I mean, there's a huge caveat there, of course, which is, by definition, people who believe in an afterlife believe it's real, and sort of by definition, people who don't believe in an afterlife don't believe it's real. And so it's quite hard to separate the fact that if you believe in an afterlife, you do believe that someone still exists in some sort of way, but in a different way. And if you don't, you believe they're really, really gone. So it's quite hard to control for whether that's kind of advantageous or not. Because as far as I'm aware, there are not any major world religions where there is no kind of, there's nothing afterwards. You know, there's always something afterwards. And so that's quite tricky. There is some evidence that the flip side to that is that there, in some circumstances, it can be disadvantageous, particularly if it's pushing people to do things they're not happy with. So, for example, religions in which there is a kind of requirement to mourn the dead, every year on their anniversary. That for some people that may be beneficial, for some people that may prolong the process. So it's a bit of a mixed bag, I think, on that. Difficult, and of course, very difficult to know how you might use that. You can't sort of go and tell people, go and believe because it's better for you. That's not how it works, I think. So an really interesting topic, though.
Working? Okay. Thank you for the lecture. It was really interesting. I have two questions, if that's all right. First, about the ambiguous loss. Is that a mental disorder then?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think that's a challenge. You will be able to talk to psychiatrists who say, yeah, this is definitely a disorder, and you'll talk to other psychiatrists who say, this is just normal life. And I am happily not a psychiatrist or a psychologist, and so I will say, this is fraught, and I'm really happy that I don't have to make the decision. So yes, I think there are clearly cases, there are clearly individuals for whom grief extends for such a long period of time and has such an impact on their life that I think you would say it is massively impacting and they would benefit from help. There are also cases, I think, where you just think, gosh, that person's had a miserable time, and I completely sympathise.
Okay, and also delayed grief, is that a thing? So, for example, in like a child who has lost a parent quite early on in life and then later on ends up grieving, is that still grief?
Yeah, there is absolutely, that is absolutely a thing. And there's quite a lot of evidence about delayed grief that can be delayed for a very long period of time, particularly if the loss was unexpected and traumatic, so car crash or homicide or something like that. There is quite a bit of evidence that it can be much more impactful actually later on because people haven't sort of processed originally. So that's definitely an area where I think there's a lot that we can do to kind of help support people in that situation.
Thank you so much.
Maybe a question online. Going into the cultural area, our rituals for grieving, for burial, do they automatically help us grieve? So for example, I remember when my granddad passed, everyone forced me to see him being dead because it will help you get over it. And it did not help me. It was quite scary for a kid. But in the rituals of letting go, preparing someone for burial, burying someone, does that actually help? Has culture come up with a system helping us go through the grieving process, or is that just a myth?
Yeah, I think, so again, I think this is hugely individual. So it is absolutely clear that for some people, an extensive funeral process is helpful. And it is very clear that for other people, it is not helpful. So I think, the strongest possible rule, if there is a rule, is you should do what feels right to you and not what somebody tells you should do. There is, I mean, probably going back in time, evolutionary, there probably was benefit in that reinforcement because, clearly if you're sort of, if you think back thousands of years, mortality rates were very, very high. People would die all the time. And so there is this kind of element of early hunter-gatherer populations needing to remember that, Fred is actually dead and not just, off hunter-gathering. And so in that setting, maybe it was. I think today in modern society, it's very much about what feels right for you. And it can be, there's good evidence that for some people it can be very helpful and for other people it can cause long-lasting trauma. So yeah, that's definitely one to tread carefully with.
Thank you. Maybe a question from the back of the hall?
Thank you, Robin. I just wanted to ask about when people mention dying of a broken heart, is that related to the increased risks of cardiovascular and things that you mentioned earlier?
Yeah, I think isn't that interesting? I suspect it probably is. So if you look in sort of historical literature, we've been talking about dying of a broken heart for hundreds, probably thousands of years. So at one level, maybe that's just, someone came up with this catchy phrase and everyone's like, that's a good phrase, I'm going to use it. I suspect it's not. I suspect it's that particularly in, periods when we didn't have as good support for bereavement as we do now, cardiac mortality would have been quite a significant impact, I think. If you think back in time when infant mortality was much higher, for example, there are pretty good documented cases of, people losing children then dying of heart attack fairly swiftly afterwards. And we know even today that that is a big cause of things. So yes, I suspect dying of a broken heart is a real thing.
So online, there's one which is quite interesting. They're all interesting, but this idea of why do we grieve for people we don't personally know?
Yeah, that's fascinating, isn't it? Grief for, the most obvious is pop stars and things, right? People, the kind of outpouring of grief we see over the, people based in the UK, Princess Diana these years ago, Michael Jackson, people that most of us have never met. I think part of that is, it's kind of mixed there. Part of that, I think, is very closely related to what we talked about at the end, this idea that we can transfer grief onto things that we know are not alive, like robots. And so actually, it's not a big jump to transfer it onto people that we definitely know were alive and are not anymore, even though we didn't have an association with them. Partly it's that. Partly, I think, is this thing that we mentioned at the beginning, that actually this is an emotion that is so universal, we all instinctively know at least part of what it must feel like. I happily, have not had some of the most horrendous bereavements that people can have, but I can kind of extrapolate. I can extrapolate from the loss of a grandparent, for example, and think that was bad. So the loss of a child must be like way, way worse than that. And you can kind of get this sort of sense of scaling. So I think, if someone dies who you've never met personally, you can nonetheless feel for the fact that, gosh, that's awful for their family and things. And then I think the third part is, we know there is quite a big sort of social meme aspect around some of this. And so one of the interesting things about, say, for example, Michael Jackson died and huge outpouring of grief in many communities. Other pop stars who die don't have the same process, even though they might have had almost as many people who listen to their records. And it's about that kind of snowball effect that you start to see people grieving. I suspect many of us experience that, right? You might go to a kind of tearjerker movie and you'll be fine until you look at the person next to you and they're like, and then you think, oh now I'm crying too. So there is definitely this idea of, communal grief that kind of is triggered by that process too, I think.
It's interesting that you mentioned films because there are a lot of references here to H is for Hawk coming out, I think, this week, and Hamlet.
Oh, yeah.
So this communal experience of seeing someone else grieve and then relating to that in a way.
And I think that's a really interesting point, actually, and that gets back, I think, to this idea of the reward circle. Like, it's completely counterintuitive. Like, why would we choose to go, perhaps pay money, to watch something that's going to make us cry? Like, that does not make sense. And I have to say, to me, who absolutely loathes tearjerker movies, it still doesn't make sense. But I appreciate that actually many people do seek it out. And I think that's because it's a way of triggering this reward circuit. So it kind of feels good, even though it feels miserable, which is a very weird and interesting area.
I think we've got more time for one more, maybe. Could we go to the front? Yeah, thank you.
Hello. Hi, thank you for the talk. I was wondering if there was any research on not being able to grieve, like because of trauma or the environment isn't allowing or holding that.
Yeah, interesting. So unusually, for many emotions, and those who've been to previous lectures know, there are often brain lesions that lose the emotion. So for example, there are people who, lose a sense of humor, or people who laugh inappropriately, or these kind of things because of a stroke or a traumatic brain injury. That doesn't seem to exist for grief. So we haven't identified people who have selectively lost the ability to grieve, but their other brain functions are still present. And that's probably because, as we showed early on, the brain, lots and lots of areas are involved. So there's not a bit of the brain that controls grief, and therefore that you might lose in a stroke. The closest you get, as we mentioned, is extensive disorders of emotional understanding, like psychopathy, do generally impact on your ability to grieve. But even then, there are quite clear cases of people who are, serial killers who have very low levels of emotional understanding of other people's traumas, but might still grieve for their own parents' death, for example. So the two things are not completely linked together. The idea of kind of social curbs on grief absolutely gets back to the question from here about this idea of delayed grief. And there are lots and lots of kind of case histories of people who have been unable to grieve, either because sort of social pressure means you just stiff up a lip, let's all keep it together, or actually just physical circumstances. And conflict is the most obvious. You just might not have time to grieve because you're too busy surviving, and then the consequences of that are usually much more potent than if you'd grieved at the time.
I think this is it for the time. I've never seen so many questions in the hall left unanswered, which makes me feel really guilty, but also online. So we might have to think about gathering some questions. So you might want to scan the QR code and enter your question there, because I think it really has struck a chord. Can I, before we properly close off, ask you a question, by show of hands, and please don't mention any names because it might be picked up by the microphones. If I asked you, have you ever truly hated someone, who would say yes to that? It's not. Okay, it's just an anticipation of the next lecture on the 4th of March. Why do we hate? Big word, because we could just as well say dislike.
Yep, no, not dislike.
So it gives you an idea for 4th of March. But thank you very much again, Robin, for this fascinating lecture.
Pleasure. Thank you very much.